Chameleon Effect. The chameleon effect is a psychological phenomenon in which individuals unconsciously mimic the behaviors, gestures, speech patterns, or mannerisms of those they are interacting with. Like a chameleon blending into its environment, people subtly adapt to their social surroundings in ways that foster connection, rapport, and a sense of belonging, often without realizing they're doing it. This effect was formally studied by psychologists Tanya Chartrand and John Bargh in the late 1990s, who found that participants in conversations would automatically imitate the posture, facial expressions, and movements of their interaction partners. Interestingly, this mimicry occurred even when the individuals weren't consciously aware of it. Moreover, those who were mimicked reported liking the person more and feeling a greater sense of connection, showing that mimicry not only reflects social bonding but also reinforces it. The chameleon effect plays a vital role in human interaction. It acts as a kind of nonverbal social glue, helping to synchronize emotions and establish empathy. When we mirror someone's body language or tone of voice, we're often signaling attentiveness and understanding. This is why skilled communicators, such as therapists, negotiators, or charismatic leaders, often engage in subtle mimicry. It helps others feel seen, heard, and comfortable. On an unconscious level, the chameleon effect is part of our evolutionary wiring. Social animals, including humans, have long depended on group cohesion for survival. Mimicry fosters affiliation and reduces social friction, enhancing our ability to cooperate, empathize, and predict each other's behavior. It is also linked to the function of mirror neurons in the brain, which help us intuitively understand and internalize the actions and emotions of others. However, this effect isn't always symmetrical. Some people are more prone to mimicry, often those who are more empathetic or socially motivated, while others may resist or avoid mirroring, especially in contexts where trust or comfort is low. Mimicry can also feel manipulative if it is perceived as insincere or excessive, especially when used deliberately to influence or persuade. The chameleon effect reveals just how deeply interconnected our social behavior is. It shows that communication is more than words, it is a dance of subtle cues, mirrored rhythms, and emotional resonance. Whether we're aware of it or not, we are constantly adjusting ourselves to the people around us, and in doing so, we shape and are shaped by every interaction we have. The placebo effect. The placebo effect is a psychological and physiological phenomenon in which a person experiences a real improvement in their symptoms after receiving a treatment that has no active therapeutic ingredients. This effect reveals the profound influence that belief, expectation, and perception can have on the body and mind. What makes the placebo effect remarkable is that the improvement is not imagined or faked. It can produce measurable changes in health, including reductions in pain, anxiety, and even symptoms of disease. The term placebo typically refers to a substance or procedure that has no specific medical action on the condition being treated, such as a sugar pill, saline injection, or sham surgery. Yet, when patients believe that the treatment they are receiving is genuine and effective, their brain and body can respond as if the treatment were real. This response is driven largely by psychological mechanisms, particularly the power of expectation. When someone expects to feel better, that expectation alone can trigger the brain to release chemicals such as endorphins or dopamine, which are associated with pain relief, mood enhancement, and healing processes. The placebo effect highlights the deep interconnection between the mind and the body. For example, a patient who believes they are receiving a powerful painkiller may report reduced pain and even show neurological patterns consistent with real pain relief, despite having taken an inert substance. These effects are not limited to subjective experiences like pain or mood, they have been observed in physiological measures such as heart rate, blood pressure, and even immune response. Importantly, the placebo effect is not deception in the traditional sense. Patients aren't simply fooled into feeling better, rather, the body responds to the belief in treatment as though it were medicine. The context in which treatment is given, the confidence of the doctor, the rituals surrounding medication, the appearance of the pill, can all enhance the effect. In this way, healing is not just about the chemical content of a drug, but also about the meaning the patient assigns to the treatment. Research has even shown that the placebo effect can occur with full awareness. In some studies, patients who were told they were receiving a placebo still experienced improvements, suggesting that the ritual of care and the symbolic value of treatment itself can activate beneficial responses in the brain. The placebo effect also poses complex ethical questions in medicine. While it underscores the importance of empathy, trust, and doctor-patient communication, it also challenges the idea that healing must always come from active pharmacological intervention. It reminds us that the mind's role in recovery is not secondary, but central, capable of producing real outcomes through expectation, hope, and belief. Ultimately, the placebo effect is not just a quirk of medicine, it is a window into the extraordinary capacity of the brain to influence the body. It reveals how perception can shape biology and how the experience of healing is as much about meaning and belief as it is about molecules and mechanics. Stroop Effect. The Stroop Effect is a well-known psychological phenomenon that reveals the interference that occurs when the brain is faced with conflicting information. It demonstrates how automatic processes, like reading, can disrupt more deliberate actions, such as naming the color of a word. This effect highlights the complexity of attention, cognitive control, and how our brains manage competing demands. The classic demonstration of the Stroop effect involves a list of color words, such as red, blue, green, printed in ink that does not match the meaning of the word. For example, the word green might be printed in red ink. When asked to say the color of the ink, rather than read the word itself, people tend to take longer to respond and make more errors. This delay and confusion occur because reading is such an automatic and well-practiced skill that it overrides the more effortful task of color identification. The effect is named after John Ridley Stroop, who first published this interference phenomenon in 1935. His experiments showed that people could more easily name the ink color when the words were neutral, like table printed in green, or match the ink, like blue written in blue, but significantly struggled when the word's meaning and ink color were mismatched. What makes the Stroop effect fascinating is that it illustrates how our brain processes conflicting signals. Reading the word is fast, involuntary, and deeply ingrained. Identifying the color of the ink, on the other hand, is slower and requires more conscious attention. When these two processes compete, the automatic one tends to interfere with the intentional one, slowing us down and increasing the likelihood of mistakes. The Stroop effect is more than just a cognitive curiosity. It has been widely used in psychological research to study attention, processing speed, and executive control. It has also served as a diagnostic tool in clinical psychology, helping to assess cognitive functioning in individuals with conditions such as ADHD, dementia, depression, or brain injuries. In a broader sense, the Stroop effect underscores the difficulty of overriding habitual responses, even when we are fully aware that those responses are incorrect. It demonstrates the limits of self-control and the effort required to suppress automatic behavior in favor of conscious thought. In daily life, it serves as a reminder that our minds are constantly juggling conflicting inputs, and that even the simplest tasks can become challenging when those inputs are not in harmony. Deja Vu Effect. The Deja Vu Effect is a fascinating psychological experience in which a person feels an uncanny sense of familiarity with a situation that is entirely new. The term déjà vu comes from French, meaning already seen, and it captures the eerie sensation that you have already lived through the present moment, even though you logically know that's impossible. It is a brief, often fleeting experience, and while it is common, most people report having it at some point in their lives, its underlying mechanisms remain only partially understood. Psychologically, déjà vu occurs when there is a mismatch between two processes in the brain, familiarity and recognition. In a typical situation, when you encounter something familiar, your brain not only detects that familiarity but also retrieves the context in which it was previously experienced. In déjà vu, something triggers that feeling of familiarity, but the brain fails to link it to a specific memory. You feel as though you've been there or done that before, but you can't identify when or how, because in reality, you haven't. There are several theories about what causes this disconnect. One explanation involves a brief hiccup in neural processing. For example, if the brain processes the same sensory input along two slightly out-of-sync pathways, perhaps due to a minor delay in one hemisphere, it might interpret the second input as a repeat of the first. Another theory is that déjà vu results from a brief overlap between short-term and long-term memory systems, causing something newly perceived to be mistakenly filed as an old memory. Déjà vu is more commonly reported by younger people, particularly those under stress, fatigue, or experiencing novelty. It's also more frequent in individuals who travel often or engage with a wide variety of environments and experiences, suggesting that the brain may be drawing on loosely related fragments of past events to create a false sense of recognition. While déjà vu is generally harmless, in some cases it has been linked to neurological conditions such as temporal lobe epilepsy. In these instances, the sensation may be more intense and prolonged, sometimes serving as a warning sign of a seizure. However, for most people, déjà vu is a benign and mysterious quirk of the brain, a cognitive glitch that briefly blurs the boundary between the familiar and the unfamiliar. What makes the déjà vu effect so intriguing is its emotional power. It often evokes wonder, curiosity, and sometimes even discomfort. It challenges our assumptions about memory, perception, and the nature of time, reminding us that the brain is not a perfect recording device, but an interpretive system that occasionally rewrites or misfires. In those strange moments of déjà vu, we glimpse just how delicate and complex our sense of reality truly is. Misinformation Effect. The misinformation effect is a psychological phenomenon in which a person's memory of an event becomes distorted or altered due to exposure to incorrect or misleading information after the fact. This effect shows just how malleable and fragile human memory can be. Not only is memory not a perfect recording of what happened, but it can be subtly rewritten by suggestion, implication, or false detail. This effect was famously studied by cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus in the 1970s. In a series of groundbreaking experiments, Loftus demonstrated that when people were shown videos of car accidents and then asked questions with subtly misleading language, for example, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, versus, when they hit each other, their memory of the event, including the speed of the cars or whether there was broken glass, was influenced by the wording of the question. Even small changes in phrasing were enough to implant false memories or distort actual ones. The misinformation effect is especially troubling because it often occurs without people realizing it. Once misinformation is absorbed into someone's memory, it feels just as real and vivid as their original experience. They may confidently recall false details, even in the face of contrary evidence. This is not a sign of dishonesty or poor memory, it's a fundamental vulnerability of how our brains process, store, and retrieve information. One reason the misinformation effect occurs is that memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. Every time we recall an event, we are not pulling up a fixed recording but rather piecing it together from fragments, impressions, and inferences. If new information has been introduced, through media, conversations, or leading questions, it can blend into our memory and reshape it without our awareness. The implications of the misinformation effect are wide-ranging and serious. In legal settings, eyewitness testimony can be unreliable if a witness has been exposed to leading questions, suggestive media coverage, or other sources of misinformation. In everyday life, people may misremember personal events, political facts, or historical details based on what they later hear or read, especially on social media or in emotionally charged contexts. This effect also contributes to the spread and persistence of false beliefs. Once inaccurate information becomes embedded in memory, correcting it is difficult. Even when the misinformation is explicitly refuted, the false memory may linger, continuing to influence decisions and attitudes. The misinformation effect serves as a sobering reminder that our memories are not infallible and can be easily swayed by the way information is presented to us after an event. It underscores the importance of critical thinking, careful communication, and skepticism, especially in environments where accuracy matters most. The spotlight effect. The spotlight effect is a psychological phenomenon in which people tend to overestimate the extent to which their actions, appearance, or mistakes are noticed and judged by others. It arises from the natural human tendency to be the center of our own experiences. Because we are so acutely aware of what we are doing, wearing, or feeling, we mistakenly assume that others are equally focused on us. In reality, most people are too preoccupied with their own concerns to pay as much attention to us as we imagine. This effect was formally studied by psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky, who found that individuals consistently believe they are under a brighter metaphorical spotlight than they actually are. In one experiment, participants who were asked to wear an embarrassing T-shirt into a room full of strangers thought that far more people had noticed it than actually did. The discrepancy between perception and reality revealed how inflated our sense of being observed can be. The spotlight effect is not limited to clothing or embarrassment, it can influence how we perceive our social performance, public speaking, or even casual interactions. A person might dwell on a minor social misstep, such as stumbling over a word or spilling a drink, convinced that it left a strong impression on everyone around them. In truth, most observers either didn't notice or quickly forgot about it. This bias can lead to unnecessary anxiety, self-consciousness, and even social withdrawal, especially in situations that already feel vulnerable or exposing. It can make people hesitate to speak up, try something new, or take risks, all because they fear scrutiny that is likely exaggerated or non-existent. On the flip side, understanding the spotlight effect can be incredibly liberating. Realizing that others are far less focused on our perceived flaws than we think can reduce pressure and increase confidence. At its core, the spotlight effect is a distortion of perspective. It reminds us that while we are each the main character in our own story, we are merely background figures in the stories of most others. Embracing this can lead to greater freedom, self-acceptance, and a more balanced view of how we fit into the social world. The Bystander Effect. The bystander effect is a psychological phenomenon in which individuals are less likely to offer help to a person in distress when other people are present. The presence of others creates a kind of social paralysis, diffusing the sense of personal responsibility and diminishing the likelihood that any one person will intervene. This counterintuitive behavior was first brought to widespread attention after the 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York City, where initial reports claimed that dozens of people witnessed the attack but failed to help. While later investigations revealed that the details were more complex, the event sparked intense interest in understanding why people sometimes fail to act in emergencies. At the heart of the bystander effect is the psychological diffusion of responsibility. When a person is alone and sees someone in need, they feel solely responsible for responding. But when others are present, that sense of responsibility becomes shared, or rather, diluted. Each person assumes that someone else will step in, and as a result, no one does. This effect becomes more pronounced as the number of bystanders increases, which is why help is often less likely in larger crowds than in smaller groups or individual settings. Another contributing factor is social influence. In ambiguous situations, people tend to look to others to determine how to react. If no one else is visibly concerned or taking action, individuals may interpret the situation as non-urgent, even if their instincts suggest otherwise. This hesitation is magnified by fear of judgment. People worry about overreacting or embarrassing themselves, especially if it turns out their help wasn't needed. In effect, the behavior of the crowd becomes a silent signal that everything is fine, even when it's not. The bystander effect is not a reflection of cruelty or indifference but of social and cognitive processes that can override our instinct to help. In many cases, individuals want to intervene but feel unsure or frozen, waiting for cues from others. Interestingly, studies have shown that when people are aware of the bystander effect, they are more likely to overcome it. Awareness can shift the internal question from, "Why doesn't someone do something?" to, "Why don't I do something?" Understanding the bystander effect is essential for cultivating empathy and responsibility in group settings. It reminds us that in moments of crisis, the assumption that someone else will help can be a dangerous illusion. Often, the difference between action and inaction comes down to one person deciding that they will not wait for permission from the crowd to do what is right. False consensus effect. The false consensus effect is a cognitive bias in which people tend to overestimate how much others share their beliefs, values, preferences, or behaviors. In other words, individuals often assume that their way of thinking or acting is more common or normal than it actually is. This effect leads people to believe that their opinions are more widely held and more universally correct than they truly are. This psychological phenomenon stems from a deep-rooted human need for social validation and belonging. When we believe that others see the world as we do, it reinforces our sense of being reasonable, right, and part of a shared reality. It provides comfort, reduces uncertainty, and bolsters our self-esteem. However, this mental shortcut can distort our understanding of social norms and lead to inaccurate judgments about the world around us. For example, if someone supports a particular political ideology, they might assume that most of their peers or even the general population shares that same viewpoint, even in the face of clear diversity of opinion. Similarly, if a person chooses not to wear a mask during a health crisis, they might believe that the majority of people agree with that choice, regardless of actual data or public sentiment. The false consensus effect is reinforced by the way we tend to surround ourselves with like-minded individuals, friends, social media circles, communities, creating echo chambers where our beliefs are continually echoed back to us. This selective exposure leads us to mistake the agreement we encounter in our immediate social environment as representative of the larger population. This bias can have significant consequences. It can lead to overconfidence in decision-making, resistance to differing perspectives, and polarization. It may cause people to misjudge how controversial or accepted their views are, leading to surprise, frustration, or conflict when confronted with opposing beliefs. Ultimately, the false consensus effect highlights a fundamental blind spot in human perception. It shows how our personal worldview can unconsciously shape our assumptions about others and how important it is to remain open to the diversity of thoughts, experiences, and values that exist beyond our own perspective. Recognizing this bias is the first step toward more accurate, humble, and empathetic social reasoning. Social loafing. Social loafing is a psychological phenomenon in which individuals exert less effort when working in a group compared to when they work alone. It reflects a decline in personal accountability and motivation that often occurs when responsibility is spread across multiple people. The larger the group, the more likely it is that some members will feel less compelled to contribute fully, assuming that others will pick up the slack. This effect was first demonstrated in the late 19th century by French agricultural engineer Max Ringelmann. In his experiments, individuals were asked to pull on a rope, both alone and in groups. Surprisingly, he found that the total force exerted by a group was less than the sum of each individual's effort. In fact, the average effort per person decreased as the group size increased, a pattern now widely known as the Ringelmann effect, a foundation of social loafing. The underlying mechanism of social loafing is a diffusion of responsibility. When people work in a group, the sense of personal accountability tends to diminish. Individuals may believe that their personal contribution is less visible, less essential, or that others will compensate for their lack of effort. This mindset can lead to disengagement, especially when the task is perceived as unimportant, when the group is large, or when individual performance is not being tracked. Social loafing can be particularly damaging in professional, academic, or creative settings where collaboration is key. It often manifests in group projects, team assignments, or shared responsibilities, any situation where individual efforts are not clearly distinguished. In such cases, highly motivated members may become frustrated by carrying the burden for others, which can breed resentment and reduce group cohesion over time. Interestingly, social loafing is not universal. It is less likely to occur when individuals feel their contribution is meaningful or essential, believe their work will be individually evaluated, are part of a cohesive or close-knit group where loyalty or identity is strong, are intrinsically motivated by the task itself. Cultural background also plays a role. Studies have found that individuals from collectivist cultures, where group harmony and responsibility are emphasized, are generally less prone to social loafing than those from individualistic cultures, where personal achievement is often prioritized. Combating social loafing requires deliberate strategies, assigning clear individual roles, establishing accountability, recognizing individual contributions, and fostering group norms that value effort and cooperation. By understanding how and why social loafing arises, teams and leaders can design more effective group dynamics, ones that encourage each member to bring their best, not hide behind the crowd. Projection bias. Projection bias is a psychological effect in which individuals mistakenly assume that their current thoughts, feelings, preferences, and emotional states will remain stable in the future. It reflects a tendency to project the present self onto future circumstances, leading to distorted expectations, flawed decisions, and misjudgments about what we, or others, will want or feel later on. This bias often emerges in decisions involving delayed consequences. For instance, someone grocery shopping while hungry is more likely to overpurchase food, assuming their future self will want as much as they currently crave. In that moment, they fail to account for how their hunger is temporary and allow it to disproportionately influence a decision meant to serve them beyond the immediate moment. Similarly, someone who is feeling optimistic might overestimate their future motivation to take on tasks, sign up for commitments, or make plans that seem appealing in the present. But when the time comes, when moods, energy levels, or external circumstances have shifted, they may regret those decisions or fail to follow through. Projection bias doesn't just distort how we view our own future selves, it also affects how we perceive others. People often assume that others think, feel, or prioritize the same way they do. This can lead to misunderstandings in relationships, negotiations, or leadership, where an individual's current mindset is mistakenly applied to another person who may be in a completely different emotional or mental state. At its core, projection bias stems from the challenge of effective forecasting, the human difficulty in accurately predicting future emotions and needs. Our current mental state tends to dominate our thinking, making it hard to detach from the present and consider how dramatically our feelings, desires, and perspectives can change over time. This bias has significant implications in everyday life. Financial planning. People may assume their spending habits or savings goals will stay the same, underestimating future expenses or overestimating their self-control. Health behavior. A person may overcommit to a workout plan while feeling motivated, forgetting how future fatigue or stress could alter that enthusiasm. Consumer behavior. Marketing often exploits projection bias, encouraging consumers to make choices based on heightened emotions in the moment, such as buying comfort items when sad or luxury items when feeling confident. Overcoming projection bias requires conscious effort to mentally simulate future states with greater realism. This means acknowledging that our moods are fluid, our motivations shift, and our future selves may not share our current perspective. Practicing mindfulness, delaying impulse decisions, and learning from past patterns can help individuals make choices that better align with their long-term well-being, rather than the fleeting conditions of the present. Halo Effect. The halo effect is a well-documented cognitive bias in which our overall impression of a person, company, brand, or product influences how we perceive their individual traits or qualities. It is a form of mental shortcut, an unconscious tendency to let one positive characteristic spill over and shape our judgments in unrelated areas. This effect was first named by psychologist Edward Thorndike in the 1920s after he observed that commanding officers tended to rate their soldiers consistently high or low across a range of attributes, such as intelligence, leadership, and physical appearance, based on a single positive or negative impression. If a soldier looked neat and confident, he was more likely to be seen as competent and smart, even if there was no evidence for those traits. A classic example of the halo effect in everyday life is how physical attractiveness can impact our judgment. Attractive individuals are often perceived as more intelligent, kinder, more capable, and even morally superior, a phenomenon sometimes referred to as the "what is beautiful is good" stereotype. This isn't necessarily conscious, rather, our brains unconsciously project a positive aura around them, coloring our perceptions. The halo effect doesn't just apply to people, it also affects how we evaluate brands, products, and public figures. For instance, if a tech company releases a widely successful product, people may begin to view all its offerings more favorably, even if some are mediocre. Or if a celebrity is known for their charity work, audiences may be more likely to excuse their personal flaws or scandals. This bias can have powerful consequences. In hiring, education, law, and leadership, the halo effect can lead to overestimating someone's competence or underestimating their faults, simply because of one standout trait. It can cloud judgment, create blind spots, and even reinforce systemic inequalities. Understanding the halo effect is essential because it reminds us how fragile and biased our perceptions can be. It urges us to critically question whether we're evaluating someone, or something, based on evidence, or merely on an unconscious glow cast by one appealing trait. Mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is a psychological phenomenon in which people tend to develop a preference for things simply because they are familiar with them. In other words, the more often we are exposed to something, a person, a song, a brand, a face, or even a shape, the more we tend to like it, even if we don't consciously realize why. This effect was first formally studied by psychologist Robert Zeigarnik in the 1960s. Through a series of experiments, he demonstrated that repeated exposure to a stimulus increased participants' positive feelings toward it, even when the exposure was brief or subliminal. What's particularly intriguing is that this increase in preference can happen without any conscious awareness or logical reasoning. The object or person doesn't need to be remarkable or appealing at first glance. Familiarity alone breeds affection. The mere exposure effect plays a powerful role in many aspects of daily life. It explains why songs we initially found unremarkable become favorites after hearing them on the radio repeatedly, or why we might start to find a coworker more attractive over time, just by seeing them often. It's also why advertisers rely so heavily on repetition. By repeatedly exposing consumers to a logo, jingle, or slogan, brands become more likable and trustworthy, even if we don't have any direct experience with their products. This psychological tendency likely has evolutionary roots. From a survival standpoint, familiarity often equates to safety. In an uncertain world, unfamiliar things may signal risk, while repeated exposure can indicate a lack of threat. Over time, this ingrained comfort with the known has translated into a preference for it. However, the mere exposure effect also has limits. If initial exposure to something is strongly negative, if it evokes fear, disgust, or trauma, then repeated exposure may reinforce aversion rather than reduce it. Moreover, if exposure becomes excessive, it can lead to boredom or irritation, a phenomenon sometimes referred to as overexposure. Nonetheless, the mere exposure effect reveals how subtly our emotions and decisions can be influenced by the simple fact of repetition. It reminds us that our preferences are not always based on rational evaluation, but often emerge from unconscious, automatic processes shaped by familiarity alone. Actor-observer bias. The actor-observer bias is a well-established psychological phenomenon that refers to the tendency people have to attribute their own actions to external circumstances, while attributing the actions of others to their internal character or personality. In other words, when we explain our own behavior, we are more likely to point to the situation, but when we explain someone else's behavior, we are more likely to point to their disposition. This bias stems from the different perspectives we have as participants in an event versus as observers of others. As actors, we are acutely aware of the context surrounding our decisions, the stress we're under, the challenges we face, or the intentions behind our actions. But when observing others, we don't have access to that same internal narrative. Instead, we judge based on what we see, behavior, expressions, tone, or outcomes. The result is a systematic asymmetry in how we understand human actions. For example, if you snap at someone during a stressful day, you might explain it by saying, "I was under a lot of pressure," or "I didn't get enough sleep." But if you see someone else behaving similarly, you might think, "They're rude," or "They have a bad temper." The same action, irritability, is explained differently depending on whether you are the actor or the observer. This bias can lead to misunderstandings, strained relationships, and unfair judgments. In everyday life, it affects how we interpret everything from road rage to work performance to interpersonal conflict. It reinforces a kind of egocentric empathy. We extend understanding to ourselves but not necessarily to others, even when they might be acting under similar pressures. Interestingly, the actor-observer bias is closely related to other attribution biases, like the fundamental attribution error, which is the general tendency to overemphasize dispositional factors in explaining others' behavior. However, the actor-observer bias is unique in that it highlights the contrast between how we explain our own behavior versus others. The implications of this bias are significant in contexts such as leadership, conflict resolution, education, and therapy. When people assume others are acting out of personality flaws rather than circumstantial challenges, they are less likely to offer compassion, support, or constructive feedback. Likewise, when individuals consistently blame their own actions on external forces, they may avoid accountability or miss opportunities for growth. Recognizing the actor-observer bias encourages more balanced and empathetic thinking. It reminds us to pause before making snap judgments and to consider the unseen factors that might be influencing someone else's behavior, just as we hope others would do for us. Illusory correlation. The illusory correlation is a cognitive bias in which people perceive a relationship between two variables or events when no such relationship actually exists. This psychological effect arises from the human mind's deep inclination to detect patterns, even where none truly exist, and is especially pronounced when the information involved is distinctive, emotionally charged, or supports existing beliefs. At its core, the illusory correlation is the mind's attempt to make sense of the world by linking events that occur around the same time, even if the connection is purely coincidental. For instance, someone might believe that carrying a lucky charm improves their chances of success because they happen to win a game or pass a test while carrying it. Although there's no causal link, the simultaneous occurrence of the charm and the positive outcome creates a mental association that feels meaningful. One classic example of this effect was demonstrated in a 1967 study by psychologists Chapman and Chapman. Participants were shown a series of clinical test results and patient descriptions. They frequently identified correlations, such as linking particular drawings on a Rorschach test with certain personality traits, even though the pairings were randomly assigned. These imagined connections were not based on real data but rather on assumptions or stereotypes. Illusory correlations often fuel and reinforce prejudices and stereotypes. For example, if a person sees a member of a minority group commit a crime, they may overestimate the frequency of such crimes within that group, especially if they already hold biased views. The combination of a distinctive group and a distinctive behavior creates a memorable pairing, which the brain latches onto, despite statistical reality showing no increased correlation. This leads to the mistaken belief that the two characteristics, group membership and behavior, are linked. The illusory correlation also plays a role in various superstitions, pseudoscientific beliefs, and conspiracy theories. Because the human brain is constantly seeking order and cause-effect relationships, it often sees patterns where randomness or complexity is at play. These misperceptions can persist even when contradicted by evidence, because once an illusory belief is formed, it tends to be reinforced by selective memory and confirmation bias. Understanding this effect is crucial for critical thinking. It reminds us to be cautious when drawing conclusions based solely on anecdotal evidence or emotionally charged examples. Real correlations require systematic, statistical investigation, not just intuitive impressions. Recognizing when we might be falling prey to an illusory correlation helps guard against faulty logic, unfair judgments, and decisions based more on perception than reality. Anchoring Effect. The anchoring effect is a powerful psychological phenomenon that shapes how people make decisions, especially when estimating values, judging quantities, or negotiating outcomes. At its core, it refers to the tendency for individuals to rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive, the anchor, when making judgments or choices. Even if that initial reference point is arbitrary or irrelevant, it can exert a disproportionate influence on subsequent thinking. Imagine you walk into a store and see a jacket priced at $300, then discover another one for $150. The second jacket suddenly seems like a bargain, not because of its quality or value, but because your brain is subconsciously comparing it to the original $300 anchor. If, however, you had seen the $150 jacket first, you might have considered it expensive. This mental bias is the essence of the anchoring effect. Once an anchor is set, all future evaluations are adjusted relative to it, even if the anchor has no real bearing on the actual value. This effect has been repeatedly demonstrated in psychological research. In one famous experiment by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, participants spun a wheel rigged to stop at either 10 or 65, and were then asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. Those who landed on 65 gave significantly higher estimates than those who landed on 10, even though the spinning wheel had no logical connection to the question. The random number acted as a cognitive anchor, silently influencing their perception of what a reasonable answer might be. The anchoring effect plays a central role in negotiations, pricing strategies, and decision-making. In business, the first price thrown out, even if wildly high, can set the tone for the entire discussion. That's why savvy negotiators often try to make the first offer, knowing it will serve as the anchor around which all future counteroffers revolve. Similarly, in retail, products are often listed with a high original price / to a discounted rate. The original price, though possibly inflated, anchors the buyer's perception of value and makes the sale price seem more attractive. Even outside financial contexts, anchoring can distort how we judge people, assess risks, or make moral evaluations. First impressions, for instance, can serve as anchors in how we perceive someone's personality, even if later evidence contradicts that initial impression. Importantly, the anchoring effect works on both the conscious and subconscious levels. Even when we know that a number is random or arbitrary, its mere presence can still influence our thinking. That's what makes it so insidious, and so useful, depending on how it's employed. In short, the anchoring effect reveals just how vulnerable human judgment is to context and framing. The first number we see, the first piece of data we hear, or the first impression we form can become the mental reference point from which all subsequent thoughts are distorted. Whether you're buying, selling, negotiating, or simply making a decision, being aware of this bias can help you recognize when you're being influenced, and when you're unintentionally influencing others. The availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut in which people judge the probability or frequency of an event based on how easily examples of it come to mind. Rather than evaluating data or thinking systematically, the human brain often relies on immediate, vivid memories or recent experiences to make quick decisions or assumptions. While this strategy can be efficient, it often leads to biased or inaccurate conclusions. This cognitive bias was first identified by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in the 1970s as part of their groundbreaking work on human judgment and decision-making. They discovered that when people are asked to estimate how common or likely something is, they tend to base their answer on how readily they can recall instances of it. If something can be easily remembered, because it was emotionally intense, frequently discussed, or widely covered in the media, it feels more common or likely, even if it is statistically rare. For example, after hearing about a plane crash on the news, a person might overestimate the danger of flying, despite air travel being one of the safest modes of transportation. Similarly, people often believe that violent crime is more prevalent than it actually is because such events are heavily reported and emotionally charged, making them more memorable. In contrast, mundane but statistically deadly risks, like heart disease or car accidents, are often underestimated because they receive less dramatic coverage or evoke less emotional response. The availability heuristic also plays out in personal experience. If someone has recently had a bad encounter with a dog, they may overestimate the likelihood that dogs are dangerous, simply because that specific memory is vivid and emotionally salient. On the other hand, if a person has never experienced a certain event directly, like a natural disaster, they may dismiss its likelihood, even if they live in a high-risk area. This bias highlights how our brains prioritize ease of recall over objective analysis. Information that is recent, emotionally powerful, or frequently repeated tends to dominate our thinking, regardless of its actual relevance or probability. The availability heuristic thus distorts our perception of reality, affecting everything from personal choices to public policy. While the availability heuristic can be useful in day-to-day decisions, especially when time or information is limited, it often leads to skewed risk assessments, irrational fears, and poor decision-making. Being aware of this mental shortcut allows individuals to pause, reflect, and ask whether their judgments are based on facts or simply on what comes to mind most easily. It encourages a more analytical mindset, one that favors data and context over anecdote and immediacy. Just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis is a psychological bias that leads people to believe that the world is fundamentally fair and just, that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. According to this belief, good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people because of their own actions or choices. This worldview offers a sense of order and predictability, but it also distorts reality and can lead to harmful judgments about others. The appeal of the just world hypothesis lies in its comforting simplicity. It reassures individuals that if they live a moral, hard-working, and responsible life, they will be rewarded, and that they can avoid suffering or misfortune by simply doing the right things. In a chaotic and unpredictable world, this belief can reduce anxiety by providing an illusion of control. However, this mental shortcut often leads to victim blaming. When people witness someone else suffering, through poverty, illness, violence, or misfortune, they may unconsciously try to protect their belief in a just world by rationalizing the victim's hardship. They might assume the person must have done something wrong to deserve their fate, the poor are lazy, the sick didn't take care of themselves, or the assaulted provoked their attacker. These explanations preserve the illusion of justice, but they lack empathy and ignore the complex, often systemic, causes behind human suffering. The just world hypothesis was first studied in depth by social psychologist Melvin Lerner in the 1960s. In his experiments, he observed that people were more likely to derogate victims of injustice when they felt powerless to change the outcome. Rather than accept that bad things can happen to good people, participants reinterpreted the situation to make it more palatable, by assuming the victim must have done something to deserve their treatment. In doing so, they protected their belief in a fair world. While the just world hypothesis can promote resilience and motivation, encouraging people to work hard, play by the rules, and hope for fair outcomes, it can also foster moral blindness and social complacency. It often discourages people from challenging injustice, because doing so would mean acknowledging that the world is, in fact, unfair. It can also make it difficult for victims of trauma or misfortune to be seen as deserving of compassion and support. Understanding the just world hypothesis helps us recognize the hidden assumptions behind our judgments of others. It invites us to see that people's circumstances are not always the result of their character or choices, but often of chance, context, or inequality. Letting go of this illusion can be uncomfortable, but it opens the door to deeper empathy, social awareness, and a more honest relationship with the truth of human experience. Optimism bias. The optimism bias is a cognitive bias that leads individuals to believe that they are less likely to experience negative events and more likely to experience positive ones, compared to others. It is a subtle yet powerful distortion of reality that paints the future in a brighter light than may be justified by facts or probabilities. While this bias can promote hope and resilience, it can also lead to unrealistic expectations and poor decision-making. At its core, the optimism bias is rooted in the human tendency to overestimate personal control, invulnerability, and likelihood of success. For instance, people often believe they are less likely than average to get into a car accident, suffer from a serious illness, or face financial hardship. At the same time, they are more likely to believe they will achieve career success, live longer than average, or experience happy relationships. This bias is not merely wishful thinking, it is deeply embedded in how the brain processes information. Neuroscientific studies have shown that when people are presented with new information, they are more likely to update their beliefs when the news is better than expected, but less likely to adjust when the news is worse. This asymmetry in how we absorb information helps sustain an overly positive view of the future. The optimism bias serves several psychological functions. It can reduce anxiety, enhance motivation, and foster persistence in the face of obstacles. Believing in a positive outcome can become a self-reinforcing loop. It encourages effort, which in turn may increase the chances of success. This is particularly useful in challenging environments, where hope and perseverance are essential to keep moving forward. However, the same bias can be risky. It may lead people to underestimate dangers, ignore early warning signs, or take on more risk than is prudent. A person might skip buying health insurance because they believe they won't get sick, or delay saving for retirement because they assume everything will work out. Optimism bias is also common in business and politics, where overconfidence in future outcomes can lead to overly ambitious projects, ignored red flags, or financial miscalculations. In social contexts, optimism bias can cause misunderstanding. People may assume others are simply being negative or anxious, not realizing that their own positive outlook is a biased filter rather than a neutral viewpoint. Ultimately, the optimism bias reveals a tension between perception and reality. While optimism can be a source of psychological strength and motivation, unchecked optimism can obscure judgment. Recognizing this bias doesn't mean becoming pessimistic, it means striving for realistic optimism, holding on to hope and confidence, while remaining aware of the full range of possible outcomes and preparing for them accordingly. Negativity bias. The negativity bias is a psychological effect in which negative experiences, emotions, or information have a significantly greater impact on our thoughts, feelings, and behavior than positive ones of equal intensity. In other words, bad is stronger than good. A single critical comment can overshadow a dozen compliments, a minor setback can linger in the mind longer than a success, and we tend to remember traumatic events more vividly and for longer than joyful ones. This bias is deeply rooted in human evolution. From a survival perspective, being highly attuned to danger, pain, and threats had clear advantages. Early humans who paid more attention to potential hazards, like predators or poisonous food, were more likely to survive and pass on their genes. As a result, our brains evolved to give priority to bad news and negative stimuli as a protective mechanism. Negativity bias is evident in many areas of life. In relationships, one hurtful interaction can outweigh many positive ones, which is why repairing trust takes sustained effort. In the media, negative stories often receive more attention and are remembered more vividly, contributing to a sense that the world is more dangerous or dysfunctional than it truly is. In personal reflection, people often dwell on regrets, mistakes, or criticisms, even in the midst of overall achievement or happiness. This bias also affects decision-making. When faced with a choice, the fear of a negative outcome often weighs more heavily than the potential for a positive one. This can lead to avoidance, hesitation, or overly conservative strategies, even when risks are manageable. In psychological terms, losses tend to loom larger than gains, a concept also supported by behavioral economics and loss aversion theory. While the negativity bias can protect us by making us cautious and alert, it can also skew our perception of reality and diminish well-being. It can lead to anxiety, chronic pessimism, and a distorted sense of what matters most. In social dynamics, it can contribute to cynicism or overreaction to minor conflicts. Understanding the negativity bias is crucial because it gives us insight into why we may overemphasize problems or feel emotionally overwhelmed by isolated negative events. It also highlights the importance of consciously cultivating positive experiences, gratitude, and balanced thinking to offset this natural tilt toward the negative. By becoming aware of how our minds prioritize negativity, we can begin to challenge the automatic weight we give it, and move toward a more accurate and emotionally healthy outlook. Overconfidence Effect. The overconfidence effect is a well-documented psychological bias in which a person's subjective confidence in their judgments or abilities is greater than the objective accuracy of those judgments. In other words, people tend to believe they are more knowledgeable, skilled, or accurate than they actually are, often significantly overestimating their competence or the correctness of their answers. This effect manifests across a wide range of tasks and domains, from answering trivia questions to making predictions about future events, evaluating one's driving skills, or assessing investment strategies. One of the most striking features of the overconfidence effect is that it persists even in the face of contradictory evidence. People may continue to hold strong beliefs about being right even after being shown that their judgments were mistaken. For example, in classic experiments, participants are asked to answer factual questions and then indicate how confident they are in their answers. Time and again, researchers have found that people frequently report being 90% or even 100% confident, when their actual accuracy might be closer to 60% or 70%. This gap between perceived and actual performance illustrates the heart of the overconfidence effect. This bias can take several forms: overestimation, where people overrate their actual performance or ability. Overplacement, where people believe they are better than others, for example, thinking they are above-average drivers or more ethical than their peers. Over-precision, where people are excessively certain that they know the truth or have correctly predicted an outcome. The overconfidence effect is partly rooted in cognitive shortcuts and the desire for certainty. Humans have a deep need to feel in control and to make sense of the world. Certainty provides comfort, even if it is unfounded. Furthermore, confidence is often socially rewarded. Confident individuals are more likely to be trusted, followed, and given leadership roles, regardless of whether their confidence is justified. However, overconfidence can have serious consequences. It can lead to poor decision-making, excessive risk-taking, and resistance to feedback. In fields like finance, medicine, and engineering, where errors can be costly or even fatal, overconfidence can be especially dangerous. In group settings, overconfident individuals may dominate discussions, leading teams astray or silencing more accurate but less assertive voices. Recognizing the overconfidence effect is a critical step toward more accurate self-assessment and better decision-making. It encourages humility, openness to alternative viewpoints, and a willingness to question one's own assumptions, all of which are essential traits for sound judgment and lifelong learning. Peak End Rule. The peak end rule is a psychological principle that describes how people evaluate past experiences not by the total sum or average of every moment, but by focusing primarily on two key aspects: the most intense point, the peak, and the final moment, the end. This mental shortcut shapes how we remember events and heavily influences our future decisions and emotional reactions. This effect was identified by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Barbara Fredrickson, who found that our memories of an experience are not faithful recordings of the entire experience but are instead dominated by its emotional high point and how it ended, regardless of how long it lasted or how we felt during the rest of the time. For instance, in an experiment involving discomfort, participants immersed their hand in painfully cold water for a set duration. In one condition, the experience ended abruptly. In another, the cold water was left on slightly longer but warmed a bit at the end. Surprisingly, many participants preferred to repeat the longer trial with the slightly more pleasant ending, even though it involved more overall discomfort. Their memory of the event was shaped more by how it ended than by the total experience. This rule plays out across many domains of life. A vacation might be remembered fondly not because every day was joyful, but because of one breathtaking moment or a perfect final evening. A movie might be loved or hated based on a powerful climax or a satisfying, or unsatisfying, ending. In relationships, people often recall and judge them based on emotional peaks, whether happy or painful, and how things concluded, even if the majority of the relationship was stable or uneventful. The peak end rule shows how our brains compress complex experiences into simplified narratives. This can be helpful, as it allows us to efficiently remember and compare past events. But it can also distort our understanding. We may repeat a harmful behavior because we recall only its emotional high, or avoid something valuable because the ending left a bad taste, even if the rest was largely positive. Understanding the peak end rule has practical implications. For anyone designing experiences, whether in customer service, education, healthcare, or entertainment, it suggests that creating a positive peak and a satisfying end can leave a far stronger impression than trying to make every moment equally enjoyable. It also reminds us, on a personal level, to question our memories. Are we judging something fairly, or simply responding to how it ended? By being aware of this bias, we can begin to make more balanced decisions and design more meaningful experiences, both for ourselves and for others. Pygmalion Effect. The Pygmalion Effect, also known as the Rosenthal Effect, is a psychological phenomenon in which higher expectations lead to improved performance. In essence, when someone, such as a teacher, manager, or parent, believes in another person's potential and communicates those positive expectations, the person is more likely to rise to meet them. This effect illustrates the powerful role that belief, perception, and subtle interpersonal cues play in shaping behavior and achievement. The term, Pygmalion Effect, comes from the Greek myth of Pygmalion, a sculptor who fell in love with a statue he had carved, which then came to life. The modern psychological version of this story was brought to prominence by a famous study conducted in the 1960s by psychologist Robert Rosenthal and school principal Lenore Jacobson. In the study, teachers were told that certain students, chosen at random, were expected to show significant academic improvement that year. Remarkably, those students did perform better, not because of any inherent ability, but because the teachers had unconsciously treated them with more encouragement, patience, and support. This phenomenon shows how our expectations can subtly influence how we interact with others. We may give more attention, offer more detailed feedback, or show more warmth to those we believe have potential. In turn, those on the receiving end of these cues begin to internalize the belief that they are capable, which can increase motivation, effort, and confidence. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Pygmalion Effect doesn't just apply to educational settings, it operates in workplaces, families, friendships, and even self-perception. A manager who believes in an employee's talent may provide more opportunities and support, resulting in actual improvement. Conversely, low expectations can have the opposite effect, stifling potential and discouraging effort. This is sometimes referred to as the golem effect. What makes the Pygmalion Effect especially compelling is that the expectations don't need to be voiced explicitly. They are often conveyed through tone, body language, facial expressions, and the amount of attention someone receives. These subtle cues can deeply influence a person's sense of self-worth and motivation, especially in formative or hierarchical relationships. At its core, the Pygmalion Effect reveals the profound impact that belief has, not only on our own actions but on the development of others. It is a powerful reminder that when we expect the best from people, we often help bring out the best in them. Recency Effect. The recency effect is a psychological phenomenon in which people tend to better recall or give greater importance to the most recent information they have encountered, compared to earlier information. It is a form of memory bias that plays a significant role in how individuals interpret experiences, make decisions, and form judgments. This effect is most commonly observed in the context of memory recall. For example, when people are asked to remember a list of items, they are typically more likely to recall the items at the end of the list than those in the middle. These last few items are said to benefit from the recency effect because they are still fresh in short-term memory at the time of recall. The recency effect is one part of a broader pattern known as the serial position effect, which also includes the primacy effect, our tendency to remember the first few items in a sequence. Together, these effects show that the position of information within a sequence can greatly influence how well it is remembered. While the primacy effect is often attributed to more time for rehearsal and transfer to long-term memory, the recency effect is usually linked to the lingering presence of recent items in working memory. But the recency effect extends beyond simple list memorization. It plays a significant role in real-life contexts such as impressions and judgments. In job interviews, for instance, the final moments of the conversation can heavily influence the interviewer's overall impression, sometimes outweighing earlier content. Consumer behavior. Advertisers and marketers often place key messages or slogans at the end of commercials, knowing that these are more likely to be remembered. Legal decisions. In courtroom settings, the last argument a jury hears, especially if it is emotionally charged, can have a disproportionate impact on their verdict. This cognitive bias arises because recent information is more readily accessible in our memory and often feels more relevant or urgent. It reflects the human brain's tendency to prioritize the now as more important or more trustworthy than what came before. While the recency effect can be useful, helping us to respond to the latest data or adapt to changing situations, it can also lead to flawed judgments. By focusing too much on recent information, we may undervalue important earlier facts or trends. For instance, a manager evaluating an employee might give undue weight to recent performance, whether good or bad, rather than considering the employee's overall record. Being aware of the recency effect allows for more balanced and deliberate thinking. Whether making decisions, evaluating information, or recalling events, understanding this bias helps us question whether our judgment is truly fair, or just a reflection of what happened most recently. Self-fulfilling prophecy. The self-fulfilling prophecy is a psychological and social phenomenon in which a person's belief or expectation, about themselves, others, or the world, subtly influences their behavior in a way that causes the expectation to come true. It's a circular process. What we believe shapes how we act, and our actions then help create the very outcome we anticipated. The term was coined by sociologist Robert K. Merton in the 1940s. He described it as a false definition of the situation evoking a new behavior, which makes the originally false conception come true. In simpler terms, even if a belief isn't accurate to begin with, it can become accurate because people behave in ways that make it so. This effect is often unconscious. A classic example is a student who is repeatedly told they're not good at math. Over time, they might internalize this label, lose confidence, and put in less effort in math-related tasks. As a result, their performance drops, seemingly confirming the original belief. The prophecy fulfills itself, not because of the student's actual ability, but because of how the belief shaped their actions and attitudes. Self-fulfilling prophecies are particularly powerful in social interactions. If someone expects others to be unfriendly, they may behave defensively or coldly, prompting others to respond in kind, thereby confirming the original expectation. In contrast, someone who expects kindness and warmth may act with openness and friendliness, eliciting positive responses from others. This mechanism can also operate at larger societal levels, through stereotypes, media narratives, and institutional expectations. For example, if society expects certain groups to be less capable or less successful, those groups may face barriers, reduced opportunities, or lowered expectations that make it harder for them to succeed, thereby reinforcing the stereotype. Importantly, self-fulfilling prophecies are not always negative. Positive beliefs and expectations can set off upward spirals. A coach who believes an athlete has great potential may train them more attentively, boosting the athlete's performance and confidence. A teacher's belief in a student's intelligence can motivate both teacher and student to strive harder, ultimately resulting in better academic results. The self-fulfilling prophecy highlights a fundamental truth about human psychology: perception influences reality. Our beliefs are not passive, they actively shape our world through the behaviors they generate. This effect reminds us to be mindful of the stories we tell ourselves and others, because those narratives often become the frameworks that determine our outcomes. Sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is a psychological trap in which people continue investing time, money, or effort into a decision or project simply because they have already invested so much in it, regardless of whether continuing is rational or beneficial. It arises from the mistaken belief that past investments justify future commitments, even when those investments cannot be recovered and the future prospects are bleak. This fallacy is rooted in our emotional attachment to loss. Human beings are naturally loss-averse. We feel the pain of losing something more strongly than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. As a result, when we've already spent resources, whether it's money on a failing business, years in a troubled relationship, or effort on a poorly chosen major, we feel compelled to make it worth it by sticking with it. Letting go feels like admitting failure, and so we double down, often throwing good resources after bad. A classic example of the sunk cost fallacy occurs in the business world. A company might continue funding a failing project because it has already spent millions on its development. Executives justify the decision by saying, "We've come too far to stop now." But rational decision-making requires that only future costs and benefits be considered, not past ones that can no longer be changed. The original investment is a sunk cost, irretrievable, and should have no bearing on whether the project should continue. The fallacy also shows up in everyday life. Someone might stay through a bad movie at the theater because they already paid for the ticket. Or continue eating food they're no longer enjoying simply because they don't want to waste it. Or remain in a job that makes them miserable because they've already spent years climbing the ladder. In each case, the past investment holds people hostage, clouding their ability to make clear, present-focused choices. What makes the sunk cost fallacy so powerful is that it often disguises itself as perseverance or loyalty. We're praised for sticking things out, not for walking away. But there's a crucial difference between being committed and being trapped. Continuing with something simply to avoid feeling like you've wasted your investment can actually lead to greater waste of time, energy, or opportunity. Recognizing the sunk cost fallacy requires a shift in mindset, from looking backward to looking forward. The question should always be, if I were starting fresh today, knowing what I now know, would I make this same choice? If the answer is no, then it may be time to cut losses and redirect resources towards something more promising. In the end, letting go of sunk costs is not a sign of failure, it's a sign of clarity, rational thinking, and emotional maturity. The Benjamin Franklin Effect. The Benjamin Franklin effect is a fascinating psychological phenomenon that turns our assumptions about kindness and favor on their head. Common sense suggests that if we do a favor for someone, we must already like them. But the Benjamin Franklin effect proposes the opposite. We tend to grow to like someone more after we do a favor for them, even if we didn't particularly like them beforehand. This counterintuitive insight is named after Benjamin Franklin himself, who famously used it in his political life. According to his autobiography, Franklin once dealt with a rival legislator who held a grudge against him. Rather than confronting the animosity or trying to win him over with flattery, Franklin instead asked the man if he could borrow a rare and valuable book from his personal library. The rival obliged. After Franklin returned the book with a note of thanks, the man began treating him with warmth and respect, and they eventually became friends. Franklin's interpretation, "He that has once done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another than he whom you yourself have obliged." Psychologically, this effect is a result of cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that arises when a person holds two conflicting beliefs. In this case, The conflict is, I don't like this person, versus, I just did something nice for them. To resolve this internal contradiction, the brain adjusts the first belief. The subconscious logic becomes, if I help them, maybe I actually like them. This adjustment restores harmony and reduces the discomfort caused by the inconsistency. The Benjamin Franklin effect demonstrates how our behavior can shape our attitudes, not just the other way around. It has meaningful implications in social relationships, leadership, and persuasion. For example, instead of trying to win someone over by giving them gifts or doing favors, which can sometimes create awkwardness or a sense of debt, asking them to help you with something small, like advice, feedback, or assistance, can ironically bring you closer. However, it's important that the request is appropriate and sincere. A favor that feels manipulative or disproportionate can backfire. But when asked in a genuine, respectful way, it not only flatters the person by showing that you value their help, but also triggers this subtle shift in how they perceive you. In a world where relationships are often built on favors, exchanges, and reciprocity, the Benjamin Franklin effect reminds us that sometimes, the most effective way to make someone like you isn't by giving, it's by asking. The false memory effect. The false memory effect is a psychological phenomenon in which a person recalls something that did not actually happen or remembers it differently from the way it truly occurred. This distortion of memory is not the result of lying or deliberate fabrication, but rather a byproduct of how memory works, an inherently reconstructive and sometimes fallible process. Unlike a photograph or a video recording, human memory is not a perfect archive of experiences. It is dynamic, subject to suggestion, and highly influenced by emotions, expectations, and external cues. The roots of false memories lie in the way the brain encodes, stores, and retrieves information. Each time we remember something, we are not retrieving a static file but rather reassembling fragments of sensory details, emotional impressions, and contextual knowledge. This act of reconstruction opens the door to errors, especially when details are unclear or when our minds attempt to fill in the blanks. Over time, these reconstructions can drift further from reality, and repeated recall can solidify the altered version, making it feel even more vivid and convincing. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, one of the most influential researchers in this area, demonstrated how easily false memories can be implanted. In her studies, participants were exposed to misleading information after witnessing an event, such as being told that a car crash involved broken glass when it did not. Many later recalled seeing broken glass, illustrating how suggestion can reshape memory. In another famous experiment, subjects were told fabricated stories from their childhood, such as being lost in a shopping mall. Even though these events never happened, a significant number of participants came to believe and elaborate on them, constructing detailed and emotionally rich accounts of entirely false experiences. This susceptibility to memory distortion has profound implications, particularly in areas like eyewitness testimony, therapy, and the legal system. A person may testify with complete sincerity about something they believe they saw, yet their memory may have been altered by stress, leading questions, or post-event information. In therapeutic settings, especially when suggestive techniques are used, clients may come to recover memories of events that never occurred, believing with absolute conviction that they are real. The false memory effect also reveals how deeply memory is entwined with identity. Our sense of self is built upon the stories we remember and tell about our lives. When those memories are flawed or fabricated, it not only changes how we understand the past but can also influence our present emotions, beliefs, and decisions. A false memory of trauma, for instance, can lead to real emotional distress, even if the event never occurred. What makes false memories particularly striking is that they are often accompanied by a high level of confidence. People generally cannot tell the difference between a real and a false memory unless objective evidence contradicts it. This makes them psychologically powerful and potentially dangerous, especially when others, such as authority figures or trusted sources, unknowingly reinforce them. Despite these vulnerabilities, the study of false memories also highlights the remarkable flexibility of the human mind. Memory's reconstructive nature allows us to adapt, imagine, and integrate new perspectives, making it a tool not only for recall but for interpretation and meaning-making. However, this same flexibility also means that memory is never purely objective. It is shaped by our emotions, beliefs, and the narratives we create about ourselves and the world. In essence, the false memory effect reminds us that what we remember is not always what actually happened. Memory is not just a record of experience but a living, changing mental construction, one that serves our psychological needs as much as it reflects reality. Barnum Effect. The Barnum Effect, also known as the Forer Effect, is a psychological phenomenon in which people tend to accept vague, general statements as highly accurate descriptions of themselves, even though these statements could apply to almost anyone. This effect reveals a common cognitive bias, the tendency to see personal meaning in information that is actually nonspecific. The term Barnum Effect is named after the showman P.T. Barnum, who was known for saying, "There's a sucker born every minute," and whose acts often involved exploiting human gullibility. Psychologist Bertram R. Forer famously demonstrated the effect in a 1948 experiment. He gave his students a personality test and then provided each student with what he claimed was an individualized analysis. In reality, each student received the same generic paragraph made up of vague, flattering statements like, "You have a great need for other people to like and admire you," or, "While you have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them." The students rated the accuracy of the analysis at an average of 4.26 out of 5, indicating that they felt it strongly reflected their personality, even though it was entirely generic. This effect is a cornerstone of many pseudoscientific practices such as astrology, fortune-telling, palm reading, and certain personality tests. These systems often rely on statements that sound insightful but are actually crafted to be universally relatable. Because individuals are naturally inclined to view themselves as unique and complex, they often interpret these statements in a way that confirms their self-concept, ignoring the lack of specificity. The Barnum Effect highlights how easily human perception can be manipulated, especially when people are eager for self-understanding or validation. It also underscores the importance of critical thinking and skepticism, particularly when evaluating claims about personality or identity that come from unscientific sources. Understanding this effect is essential not just for avoiding deception, but also for recognizing the ways our minds seek meaning, even where there may be none. Endowment Effect. The endowment effect is a psychological phenomenon in which people place a higher value on something simply because they own it. This effect causes individuals to demand more to give up an item than they would be willing to pay to acquire it in the first place. In essence, ownership creates an emotional attachment that inflates perceived worth, even if the item itself hasn't changed in any objective way. This concept is rooted in behavioral economics and was notably demonstrated in studies by psychologists Daniel Kahneman, Jack Netsch, and Richard Thaler. In a classic experiment, participants were randomly given a simple object, such as a coffee mug, and then asked whether they would be willing to trade or sell it. Remarkably, those who had received the mug typically valued it much more than those who didn't own it, even though both groups were dealing with the same exact item. The mere fact of ownership made the object seem more desirable. The endowment effect can be understood through the lens of loss aversion, a principle from prospect theory which suggests that people feel the pain of losing something more strongly than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. Once we own something, giving it up feels like a loss, and losses loom larger than equivalent gains. As a result, people often irrationally cling to possessions, overvalue what they have, and resist making trades or changes, even when it might be in their best interest. This effect shows up in everyday life in many subtle ways. For example, homeowners often set unrealistic prices for their houses because they've attached sentimental value to them, while potential buyers view them with a more objective eye. Similarly, people may overprice used items in resale markets or hold on to unused belongings because they feel a sense of personal investment that others do not share. The endowment effect can also influence decision-making in areas like negotiation, investing, and consumer behavior. It can lead to inefficient choices, such as sticking with underperforming assets simply because one already owns them, sometimes called the status quo bias. In negotiations, it may cause people to reject fair offers because they feel their own position is worth more than it objectively is. What makes the endowment effect particularly striking is that it occurs even with trivial or newly acquired items, things that people didn't choose, didn't earn, and might not have cared about just moments before. Ownership alone creates a shift in perception. Ultimately, the endowment effect highlights how deeply our sense of value is influenced by subjective, emotional factors rather than objective utility. It reminds us that our attachment to things, however small, can cloud judgment and lead us to overestimate the worth of what we already have, simply because it is ours. Pratfall Effect. The Pratfall Effect is a psychological phenomenon in which a person's likability actually increases when they make a small mistake, but only if they are otherwise perceived as competent or impressive. The term pratfall refers to a clumsy mistake or a minor blunder, like spilling coffee or tripping over a word. While such errors might seem embarrassing or harmful to one's image, in certain cases, they can have the opposite effect. They humanize the individual, making them appear more relatable, authentic, and endearing. This effect was first identified in the 1960s by psychologist Elliot Aronson. In his famous experiment, participants listened to recordings of people answering a series of quiz questions. When a highly competent person accidentally spilled coffee at the end of the quiz, they were rated as more likable than when they made no mistake at all. Interestingly, if the person was seen as average or mediocre, the blunder made them seem less likable. In other words, the pratfall only boosts appeal when it's seen as a charming flaw in an otherwise admirable individual. The psychology behind this effect lies in the way people form impressions. High competence can sometimes create distance. It can make someone seem intimidating, untouchable, or overly polished. A small slip-up disrupts this image just enough to make them seem more human, more like one of us. It reduces the perceived gap and makes connection easier. The pratfall creates vulnerability, and vulnerability often fosters warmth and trust. The pratfall effect shows up in many real-world contexts. A charismatic speaker who fumbles a word and laughs it off can come across as more approachable. A skilled leader who admits a small oversight may be respected more for their humility. Celebrities or public figures who show self-deprecating humor often benefit from this effect, as it balances their public image with a sense of humanity. However, this effect has boundaries. If the mistake is too serious or if the person is not seen as competent to begin with, the pratfall doesn't help. it can reinforce doubts or negative impressions. The charm of the pratfall lies in its contrast to perceived excellence. It adds dimension, not damage. In essence, the pratfall effect is a reminder that perfection can be alienating, and that people often connect more deeply with those who are capable yet imperfect. It shows how a touch of vulnerability or self-revealing error, when handled with grace, can actually strengthen how others see us, not despite our flaws, but partly because of them. Third-person effect. The third-person effect is a psychological phenomenon in which individuals believe that others are more susceptible to media influence than they are themselves. In other words, people tend to think that persuasive messages, whether in advertising, propaganda, or political campaigns, affect them, other people, far more than me, themselves. This bias reflects a deep-seated tendency to see oneself as more rational, critical, or immune to manipulation than the average person. The term was introduced by communications scholar W. Phillips Davison in 1983. His theory suggested that when people encounter messages in the media, they often assume a position of detachment, believing they can analyze and resist the content rationally, while imagining that others will passively absorb it and be unduly influenced. This perception is especially pronounced when the media content is viewed as negative, controversial, or manipulative, such as violent video games, political propaganda, or misleading advertisements. The third-person effect arises from a combination of cognitive and social motivations. Psychologically, people like to maintain a positive self-image and preserve the belief that they are autonomous thinkers. Socially, viewing others as more gullible can reinforce feelings of intellectual or moral superiority. This bias is often stronger among educated or media-literate individuals who feel especially confident in their critical thinking skills. However, this effect can have real-world consequences. Believing that others are easily swayed can lead to calls for censorship or media regulation, even when the individual making the demand doesn't feel personally threatened. It can also distort our understanding of public opinion. For example, someone might assume that a political ad is dangerously effective, not because they are influenced by it, but because they believe the masses will be. Ironically, this bias can leave people more vulnerable than they realize. By underestimating their own susceptibility to media influence, individuals may lower their guard or fail to scrutinize messages as carefully as they should. The third-person effect blinds us not only to how media affects others, but also to how it may shape our own attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, often in subtle ways. Ultimately, the third-person effect highlights a discrepancy between how we see ourselves and how we perceive others. It reminds us that we are all subject to influence, whether we recognize it or not, and that the most effective form of persuasion is often the kind we believe only works on someone else. Name-letter effect. The name-letter effect is a subtle yet fascinating psychological phenomenon in which people tend to show a preference for the letters in their own name, especially the first letter. This effect is most evident when individuals are asked to rate letters of the alphabet, and they consistently rank the letters in their own name, particularly their initials, more favorably than other letters. Though this may seem trivial on the surface, it reflects deeper aspects of self-perception and unconscious bias. First identified by social psychologist Joseph Nutton in the 1980s, the name-letter effect revealed that people tend to gravitate toward letters associated with their identity, even when there is no logical reason for doing so. For example, someone named Daniel is more likely to rate the letter D as more attractive than someone who does not have a name containing that letter. This preference is believed to stem from a broader psychological principle, the implicit egoism hypothesis. According to this idea, people are unconsciously drawn to things that reflect or resemble themselves, because they tend to hold positive associations with their own identity. Since our names are deeply intertwined with our self-concept from a very early age, even the letters that form them can trigger subtle feelings of familiarity, comfort, and self-affirmation. Interestingly, the name-letter effect may also influence real-life decisions, often in ways people aren't aware of. Research has shown that people are slightly more likely to live in cities, choose careers, or marry people whose names, or initials, resemble their own. For instance, a person named Laura may be marginally more likely to become a lawyer, or someone named Sam might be drawn to live in San Diego. While these effects are small and statistical in nature, they are consistently found across large data sets, suggesting that the unconscious preference for self-related cues does indeed influence behavior. What makes the name-letter effect so intriguing is that it operates beneath the level of conscious awareness. People don't typically realize they're favoring certain letters because of personal attachment. It's not about vanity or pride, it's about the deep emotional associations we form with elements of our identity that feel safe, familiar, and affirming. In sum, the name-letter effect offers a glimpse into the subtle ways self-perception can shape our attitudes and choices. It highlights how even something as seemingly meaningless as a letter of the alphabet can carry personal weight, reflecting the powerful influence of identity on cognition and decision-making. Framing effect. The framing effect is a cognitive bias in which people's decisions and judgments are significantly influenced by how information is presented, rather than just the information itself. In other words, the way a choice or scenario is framed, whether in terms of gains or losses, positives or negatives, can drastically affect how individuals respond, even when the underlying facts remain constant. This phenomenon is central to the field of behavioral economics and was first extensively explored by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who demonstrated through a series of experiments that people do not always make rational choices. Instead, their decisions are often shaped by emotional and cognitive shortcuts, or heuristics. To illustrate the framing effect, consider the following example involving a medical treatment. Gain frame: a doctor tells a patient that a surgery has a 90% survival rate. Loss frame: the doctor tells another patient that the same surgery has a 10% mortality rate. Even though both statements convey the same statistical reality, people tend to feel more comfortable and optimistic when hearing the 90% survival rate than when confronted with the 10% mortality rate. The difference lies entirely in the emotional tone and implications evoked by the framing. One suggests safety and success, the other hints at danger and risk. The framing effect often leads people to make inconsistent or irrational decisions depending on how a problem is worded. For example, in one classic experiment by Tversky and Kahneman known as the Asian disease problem, participants were asked to choose between two programs to combat a hypothetical disease expected to kill 600 people. When the programs were framed in terms of lives saved, gain frame, most people preferred a more certain outcome. But when the same choices were framed in terms of deaths, loss frame, participants leaned toward riskier options. This shift in preference, triggered solely by wording, reveals how framing can alter risk tolerance and judgment. Framing also plays a powerful role in areas like marketing, politics, law, and public health. In marketing, a product labeled as 95% fat-free is more appealing than one labeled contains 5% fat, even though both are true. Politicians might describe tax cuts as giving money back to the people, positive frame, or opponents might call the same policy defunding public services, negative frame. In courtrooms, defense attorneys may frame a crime as a mistake rather than an attack, aiming to influence jurors' emotions and interpretations. The effect is not simply a matter of wording, it taps into deep-seated psychological tendencies. People tend to be loss-averse, meaning they perceive losses as more painful than equivalent gains are pleasurable. This asymmetry amplifies the power of negative frames, often making people more reactive or risk-seeking when a situation is presented as a potential loss. Importantly, the framing effect shows that human reasoning is not purely logical or fact-based, it is sensitive to context, language, and emotional cues. Recognizing the framing effect in everyday situations can help individuals become more critical consumers of information. By rephrasing scenarios in multiple ways, one can gain a fuller perspective and make more balanced decisions. In essence, the framing effect underscores a fundamental truth of psychology: how we understand the world is not only determined by what we are told, but also how we are told it. Rebound Effect. The rebound effect, also known as ironic process theory, is a psychological phenomenon in which the deliberate attempt to suppress certain thoughts, emotions, or behaviors paradoxically makes them more persistent or prominent. In simple terms, the more we try not to think or feel something, the more likely it is to resurface, often with greater intensity. This effect was extensively studied by psychologist Daniel Wegner, who famously demonstrated it in an experiment involving a simple instruction: try not to think of a white bear. Participants were told to avoid thinking of a white bear for a short period of time. Ironically, many found it nearly impossible. The very effort to suppress the thought made it intrude more frequently into their consciousness. This experiment has since become a classic example of how suppression can backfire. The rebound effect occurs due to a conflict between two mental processes. 1. The intentional process, which consciously tries to distract from or replace the unwanted thought or emotion. 2. The monitoring process, which unconsciously checks whether the unwanted thought is appearing, essentially scanning for failure. The irony is that the monitoring process, which is supposed to help, keeps the unwanted thought mentally accessible so it can be detected and suppressed. This ongoing monitoring, especially under conditions of stress, fatigue, or mental overload, increases the likelihood that the thought will rebound. The rebound effect is not limited to abstract thoughts. It appears in various domains. Emotions. Trying not to feel anxious can often heighten anxiety. Suppressing anger or sadness can intensify those feelings later on. Habits and behaviors. Dieters who rigidly avoid forbidden foods may end up binging on them. Smokers trying to suppress cravings may feel them more intensely. Mental health. In conditions like obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, intrusive thoughts often become more distressing when individuals try to suppress them. Insomnia. Trying not to think about being awake can keep the mind alert, making sleep even harder to achieve. Additionally, the rebound effect can affect social behavior. For instance, if someone is told to avoid thinking in a prejudiced way during an interaction, their effort to suppress bias might lead to increased nervousness or even unintentional displays of the very attitudes they're trying to suppress. What makes the rebound effect especially important in psychology is that it challenges the intuitive idea that we can always will ourselves out of unwanted mental states. It reveals that cognitive control has limitations, particularly when it's forced or overly rigid. There are, however, ways to reduce the rebound effect. Mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches encourage acknowledging thoughts without judgment, rather than trying to push them away. Cognitive restructuring can help individuals reframe or reinterpret the thought rather than suppress it. Distraction, when used skillfully, can redirect attention without triggering the monitoring process. In essence, the rebound effect illustrates a paradox at the heart of self-control. Sometimes, the harder we try to push certain thoughts or feelings out of mind, the stronger they come back. Awareness of this effect can promote more flexible, compassionate, and effective strategies for managing the mind. Zeigarnik Effect. The Zeigarnik Effect is a psychological phenomenon that refers to the tendency of people to remember unfinished or interrupted tasks better than completed ones. This effect suggests that our minds are naturally drawn to what is incomplete, unresolved, or in progress, as if unfinished tasks create a kind of mental tension that keeps them active in our memory. The effect is named after Bluma Zeigarnik, a Russian psychologist who first observed and studied this pattern in the 1920s. Her curiosity was piqued while sitting in a cafe, where she noticed that waiters seemed to remember unpaid orders in great detail, but once the bill was settled, the memory of the order seemed to fade quickly. Zeigarnik later conducted a series of experiments in which participants were asked to complete a variety of tasks, puzzles, arithmetic problems, and manual activities, some of which were interrupted before they could finish. The results showed that participants were significantly more likely to recall the interrupted tasks than the completed ones. The underlying mechanism of the Zeigarnik effect is believed to be cognitive tension. When a task is left incomplete, it creates a kind of mental dissonance or open loop in the brain. This tension remains until the task is completed, at which point the brain is able to close the loop and move on. Until resolution occurs, the task remains more accessible in memory and may intrude into conscious thought. This effect is related to broader principles in cognitive psychology, including goal pursuit and working memory. The Zeigarnik effect plays an important role in many aspects of daily life. Productivity and motivation. People often feel a persistent urge to return to unfinished projects, which can be used strategically in fields like education and work management. For instance, breaking tasks into smaller parts and deliberately leaving one piece incomplete can motivate someone to return and finish it. Entertainment and storytelling. Cliffhangers in books, TV shows, and movies rely on the Zeigarnik effect to keep audiences engaged. By interrupting a narrative at a critical point, creators leave viewers with an unresolved tension that compels them to seek closure. Advertising and persuasion. Marketers might intentionally create a sense of incompleteness in messaging, such as an unanswered question or an unfinished story, to draw attention and encourage interaction or follow-up. Mental clutter and stress. On the downside, the Zeigarnik effect can contribute to feelings of mental overload, especially when people juggle multiple incomplete tasks. The accumulated open loops can make it harder to relax or focus, as the brain continues to hold on to these unresolved items. To manage the potential downsides of the Zeigarnik effect, strategies like task planning, externalizing mental to-dos, e.g., writing lists, and consciously closing loops through completion rituals can help clear cognitive space. Psychological techniques such as the Getting Things Done, GTD, method rely heavily on this principle by encouraging people to capture and organize incomplete tasks so that the brain doesn't have to keep track of them constantly. In summary, the Zeigarnik effect reveals how the human mind is wired to seek closure and resolution. It explains why unfinished business tends to stick in our memory, influencing both our motivation and emotional state. By understanding this effect, we can better harness our mental focus and reduce unnecessary cognitive strain. Dunning-Kruger Effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a well-documented cognitive bias in which people with low ability, knowledge, or expertise in a particular domain tend to overestimate their competence. Conversely, individuals with higher levels of competence may underestimate their relative ability. This psychological phenomenon was first identified and formally described in 1999 by social psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger at Cornell University. At its core, the Dunning-Kruger effect is rooted in metacognition, the ability to assess and reflect on one's own cognitive processes. For someone to recognize the limitations of their knowledge or skills, they need a certain level of understanding or expertise. Ironically, it is precisely this lack of knowledge that makes unskilled individuals unaware of their own incompetence. They not only perform poorly but are also unable to recognize just how poorly they are performing. This leads them to form inflated self-assessments. In contrast, more knowledgeable or skilled individuals tend to have a better grasp of the complexity of a subject and are often more aware of what they don't know. This can result in them rating themselves more modestly, or even underestimating their competence compared to others. They may falsely assume that what comes easily to them is equally easy for others, which can skew their perception of their relative ability. The classic example of the Dunning-Kruger effect might be seen in a novice chess player who believes they are ready for tournament-level play after winning a few games against other beginners, unaware of the strategic depth and skill required at more advanced levels. On the other end, a seasoned player might hesitate to call themselves an expert, recognizing how much more there is to master in the game. Dunning and Kruger's initial studies involved participants taking tests on grammar, logical reasoning, and humor. Those who scored in the lowest percentiles consistently rated their performance much higher than it actually was. Follow-up research has replicated this pattern across a wide range of skills and fields, including academic performance, driving ability, and even emotional intelligence. The implications of the Dunning-Kruger effect are significant, particularly in areas like education, management, politics, and social media, where confidence can often be mistaken for competence. It helps explain why misinformation spreads so easily. People may speak authoritatively on topics they poorly understand, while experts who are more cautious or nuanced in their views may be overlooked or doubted. Addressing the Dunning-Kruger effect requires both individual humility and structural efforts to promote self-awareness and critical thinking. Encouraging a culture of continuous learning, peer feedback, and openness to correction can help mitigate the effects of this bias and lead to better decision-making and communication. In sum, the Dunning-Kruger effect highlights a paradox of self-perception. Those who know the least are often the most confident in their beliefs, while those who know more tend to be more cautious. Understanding this phenomenon is a powerful tool for cultivating intellectual humility and improving both personal and collective judgment.